Jumoke Odediji, and I'm a member of the International Law Association Nigeria Committee on Women, International Law and Development. So, on behalf of the committee and our partners at Gender Inclusive Climate Change Governance Initiative, I am honored to moderate today's critical conversation commemorating the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So I welcome everyone to this webinar. And because of time, I think we can do our introductions in the chat box. All right. So to begin with, we gather today to shine a spotlight on an issue that demands urgent attention, which is the intersection of violence, disability, and women's rights in Nigeria. So as we know, women with disabilities, they remain the um, most marginalized among others in our society, and facing compounded forms of violence, discrimination, and exclusion that are often invincible in mainstream discourse. So before we begin, I would be sharing some housekeeping notes to guide us through the webinar. So first on my list is just some rundown on how the webinar would go. So the section will run for 90 minutes, ending at 1:30. And then please let's keep our microphones muted unless when speaking. And then we can all use the chat function to submit questions through the section. And then we have a dedicated question and answer segment from, I think, after the speakers are done with their presentation. So that's for the housekeeping. So just to give a brief about the International Law Association Nigeria Committee on Women, Law and Development. So I'll give a brief on what we do and who we are. Yeah, can we still hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yes,
All
we
right,
can.
thank you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. All right.
Yes. How are
Okay,
you?
so about the committee, our committee promotes the mainstreaming of women's rights and gender equality as priorities in international, regional, and national development agendas. So we foster inclusive dialogues on social and legal barriers, impacting women and families, and advocating for policy reforms that empower communities. So that's just a brief about the committee. And then to run the context of the webinar also, I would give an introduction into um, what the webinar is about and why we are here. Okay, so the global 16 days of activism against gender-based violence runs from November 25th to December 10th, providing a critical platform to amplify sorry, please pardon me. I'm done with flu. All right. So yeah, like I said, the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence provides a critical platform to amplify advocacy against all forms of violence against women and girls. And as we know in Nigeria, despite progressive frameworks such as the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, the Disability Act in 2019, and international standards like Convention on the Oh, hello. Sorry, I think my mic was muted. I'll take that again. All right. So, like I said, in Nigeria today, despite progressive frameworks such as the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, the Disability Act in 2019, and the international standards like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that's CEDAW, and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, implementing gaps still exist. And we know that women with disabilities also face significant barriers to accessing justice, healthcare, education, employment, and political participation. So today we will explore emerging developments in this field, including the sexual harassment of students, that's Prevention and Prohibition Bill in 2025, examining legal remedies, advocacy tools, and effective interventions. So now I would introduce our distinguished hosts and speakers for the webinar. So for our host, we have Dr. Pedi Obani, who is the chairperson of the Committee on Women, International Law and Development. And we have three speakers for the webinar. I would be introducing them as they come on for their presentations. So without further delay, I'm delighted to invite our chairperson, that's Dr. Pedi Obani, to deliver the opening remarks. Dr. Obani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jumoke, and good day, everyone. Thank you for being here. Really delighted to have you here with us to mark this auspicious event, which is the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. I won't go too much into what the committee does because Jumoke has kindly shared that with us already. But I just want to express my thanks to all of you for making out time to be part of this conversation. And I'm hoping that the discussions we have today will not only highlight emerging legal developments within the Nigerian context and broadly, but will reinforce the need for us to actually take action in whatever spaces we find ourselves. The theme for this year's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is around ensuring that women and girls are safe online. And that is very critical. The online space provides us opportunities to connect, to collaborate, to work together across different locations, wherever we may be. But at the same time, we know that the online space is not always safe for women and for girls. And so this is a call for all of us to make sure that in whatever we do, we provide that safe environment for women and girls online. Of course, that safety is important for everybody. It's important for other genders as well. But what we're saying is that as a committee and as people who understand that very often women experience disproportionate adverse impacts and outcomes for various reasons when we think about intersectionality, it is important that we also highlight and mainstream that focus on women. And we know that mainstreaming that focus on women will not only benefit women and girls themselves, but will provide us insights into how we can benefit other people in the society who are also marginalized or excluded, or in one way or the other experiencing some forms of discrimination. I think it's also telling that the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence ends on 10th December, which is tomorrow, and which coincides with the International Human Rights Day as well. Again, a reminder of the need for us to mainstream women's rights in whatever we do. And I think the other thing I'll mention is that the theme for today's or for this year's Human Rights Day is around everyday essentials, reminding us of the fact that human rights is not only an abstract thing, because some people may think human rights is abstract, women's rights is abstract, but it's not abstract at all. Instead, it has implications for our everyday life. And in fact, it is essential for ensuring the quality of life of people every day, everywhere. And so I think with that, I'll just say again, thank you for being here with us. And I hope that over the next few minutes or 30 minutes, 90 minutes, whatever's left of today's webinar, we engage with the conversations, we find ourselves in discussions, and we also recommit ourselves to strengthening women's rights protection and to strengthening initiatives to end gender-based violence wherever we may be. Thank you for being here, and do enjoy the rest of the webinar. And of course, if you're not already a member of the committee, do consider joining us, and feel free to send details or questions if you have any. I'll be more than happy to point you in the right direction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Peddy, for those powerful and insightful opening remarks that have set the tone for our discussion today. So we will now proceed to our panel presentations, where each speakers will have 15 minutes to share their expertise and insights on different aspects of violence, disability, and women's rights in Nigeria. So on the first presentation, our speaker um, is Dr. Obioha Ben Okoro. So yes, I would be reading his bio before I pass the mic on to him. So Dr. Obioha Ben Okoro, who serves as is the technical assistant at the United Nations Tripartite Partnership Program. And then on his bio, yeah, he holds a doctorate in international law and human rights, and he works as a technical assistant to the United Nations Tripartite Partnership Program, where he supports Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission in building capacity for human rights intervention. He also functions as the NHRC focal person for implementing decisions of African human rights bodies in Nigeria, with the responsibility of ensuring that regional human rights obligations are implemented at the national level. His work focuses on the promotion, protection, and enforcement of human rights, and he has presented research papers at academic conferences and then published several works on human rights. Dr. Ben Okoro is passionate about promoting human dignity through the ideals and principles of human rights by integrating them into law and policy. So, Dr. Ben Okoro, I would call on you to please proceed with your presentation. You have 15 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and privilege to speak. Just to confirm that I'm very audible. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay. Can I also share my screen?
I think we can do that from here, except if you want to go ahead to do that.
Okay, please, if you can do that from there, that would be very helpful. Yeah.
All right.
So thank you for this opportunity once again. Thank you, Dr. Preji, for extending the invitation to me to speak at this important event. And we are looking at violence, disability, and women's rights in Nigeria. It's very important that we understand that gender-based violence is an issue of concern. Sometimes we struggle with having a conceptual understanding of what gender-based violence is. So I'll start the presentation by talking about the definition of what gender-based violence is. First and foremost, we say it's violence directed at individuals based on gender. This is the simplest way we can present what gender-based violence is. Sometimes when you have conversations with people around gender-based violence, you always have the common issues around why are we always talking about women? Why are we always talking about women? Why not the men? It's a common issue in Nigeria. But the point about gender-based violence is not about the biological differences of male and female. The issue is about the vulnerabilities they face in society, created by the socio-economic context of a particular situation. So the definition of gender-based violence in terms of their level of vulnerabilities to the circumstances they face. And of course, in Nigeria, we know that women belong to the vulnerable group because of social factors, because of the conceptions around women culturally, socially, and I may also say politically, as you may want to look at it. But permit me to also give some level of credence to the definition given by the United Nations Declaration on Elimination of Violence Against Women, describing it as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women. So this includes such things as act, coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether it is occurring in public or private life. Now, this definition brings it within the context we can understand it clearly that we are focusing now on women as vulnerable groups that need special kind of protection. Now, when you look at the issue of gender-based violence, we look at the impact it brings to the victims. So it is both a violence that brings harm. Of course, it can be a physical harm, it can be a psychological harm. But most times people tend to focus on the harm it brings without also being able to link it with the violations of fundamental human rights and freedoms. So for every harm occasioned by gender-based violence, there is a corresponding human rights violation that has just taken place. And it's important to begin to look at it from that context for us to know why we need to provide protections, ensuring that women's rights are also considered as human rights. So we have various forms of gender-based violence. Physical violence, it can happen as sexual violence, emotional or psychological abuses, economic abuse, harmful traditional practices, online abuses, and social exclusion. While this may look as common things that happen in any society, but we are looking at the impact, the impact happens to women and how they're able to bear with the circumstance and why they need special attention. Permit me at this point to look at gender-based violence in numbers. I'm presenting to you the data from the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria. The National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria maintains a monthly dashboard presentation on situation of human rights in Nigeria. And when you look at the data presented, it's something that is done monthly, and the stakeholders are brought to the room, and the data is presented to them for them to look at emerging issues. So I've just brought out the aspect that have to do with gender-based violence, and I'm just considering 2 months, that's September and October, just to give us an insight into what the situation is in Nigeria. And for the month of September, we have gender-based discrimination reported cases over 2,408. Then for harmful cultural practices, we have 406. For forceful marriage, we have 438. For sexual and reproductive rights, we have 2,133 cases. When I call these numbers, we are talking about number of persons affected by this category of gender-based violence. So you must put that so that you begin to put a picture around it to understand that over 2,133 women within a month would have undergone sexual and reproductive rights violations. We also have denial of access to children. We have 1,968. We have inheritance issues, 138. And then abandonment. Now, when we talk about abandonment, we tend to think about the children, parents abandoning children. But in the course of our observatory for this year, 2025, we discovered a new trend of abandonment happening in Nigeria. And this has to do with abandonment of women. So it's a situation where the husbands abandon their wives and just move away without disclosing where they are going, without providing any means of livelihood. Now, while this may look on the surface level as something that one can relate to, but we begin to look at it for a woman who already has an attachment to her child, now having to have a husband abscond from the home. So what it means is that the responsibility to cater for that child rests upon the woman to cater for herself and also cater for the child. And this also is happening in a society where most women are facing economic deprivation. Sometimes you see that most women are unable to get work because of issues that have to do with gender rights. Also, some of them have issues where they are working. So there's already economic disparity. Now, the burden of having to cater a loan for the home when the husband abandons them now raises more issues of concern for the protection of the rights of women. Now, when you look at also women's trafficking, we have 397. I also have the data for October, but because of the time I have, I'll just compare the percentage. I have a slide on the percentage increase from September to October for each of these categories of violations that I've talked about. So you have gender-based discrimination increasing in October by 4.19%. You have harmful cultural practices increasing by 26.60%. You have forced marriages increasing by 25%. You have sexual and reproductive rights increasing by 6%. We have denial of access to children increasing by 5%, inheritance increasing by 77%, abandonment of women increasing by 9%, and women trafficking increasing by 21%. What does this tell us? Looking at the trends of violations of the rights of women, looking at the trends of gender-based violence, it tells us that it is increasing on a monthly basis. If you compare the data, I just brought 2 months data. So that should show that the numbers are not coming down, the numbers are increasing, and of course, this should be a source of concern to us in terms of the protection of the rights of women in Nigeria. Can you please confirm that I'm still audible so that I'll be sure I'm still very clear?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, thank you so much. So it's important as we begin to go down to the issues of disability that I also make it clear that there are various contexts where gender-based violence is exacerbated. What this means is that situations where gender-based violence is likely to happen or where its impact is felt more within the context of Nigeria. We have emerging areas like climate vulnerabilities, where you have issues of displacement. For instance, sometime last year when we had flooding in Maiduguri, in Borno State, a lot of things happened. And of course, when this happens, it means that most families will now be pushed to IDP camps where they will have to stay for a short settlement. While they're in those camps, there are a lot of issues that come out. Issues of women, of course, we know require some basic necessities to live. So when you put them in the camps, questions of those things being available becomes an issue. We also have issues of sex for food. In fact, as a matter of fact, there was a committee that was set up by the state government to help families be reunited back after the flooding incident and after all the issues that came at that time. There was also issues of exclusion coming, even on the part of disabled persons and also on the part of women. So these are areas where the vulnerability of women increases because of the circumstances of cultural, climate change affecting women in those sectors. We also have another emerging area or places of deprivation of liberty. If you go to our custodial centers, you find a number of women there, particularly even women on death row. Sometimes there was a study that was conducted and the findings reveal that most women who were found to be on death row were associated with gender-based violence, maybe reacting to it or experiencing it in one way or the other. So what made them come into those centers is because they were probably trying to defend themselves against gender-based violence, and of course, something happened and they had to find themselves in places of deprivation of liberty in custodial centers. It's also an area of concern for us to consider contexts where these cases are exacerbated. This actually is in addition to some of the conditions you find within these detention facilities and how conducive they are also for women. And of course, conflict zones. In Nigeria, we have a lot of conflicts we are confronted with. And so you get to find out that the people who are hard hit most times are women. Most of them are raped. Most of them are abducted. The northeast of Nigeria, where we have the insurgency, we have a lot of cases, reports of the violations of women's rights by non-state actors, using them as instruments of war, abducting them, and also forcefully marrying them. These are issues that continue to present women as vulnerable, even in conflict zones. So let me just move straight to the disability and women's rights in Nigeria. I'll start by just laying a brief legal and institutional framework for this in Nigeria. But it's important for me to say that what I have here is not exhaustive because of the limited time I have. So I've just tried to limit it to the ones that are relevant to us. Interestingly, Nigeria ratified the African Disability Protocol, which is a very good development for the protection of disability rights in Nigeria. And I've also brought out some specific areas that are of interest to this presentation, particularly Article 9, which explicitly protects women with disabilities from violence and discrimination. And of course, some of the good aspects of the African Disability Protocol is the fact that it also calls for gender-sensitive measures. Sometimes when you go to a justice sector, the health sector, the education sector, or public services generally, you will see that they are not positioned in a way that makes it conducive for persons with disabilities to be able to access public services. So there is this feeling of exclusion where they go to maybe the police and they want to, report a case or seek access to justice. But you find out that even the police officers are not trained to handle issues of gender-based violence. So in the course of seeking redress for violations, they are exposed to more violations because they tend to handle it as with every other case without the sensitivities associated with gender-based violence. So you have it also in the health sector and all the public services you can talk about. Another interesting development is the Berlin Declaration on Global Disability Inclusion, which happened in 2025. And interestingly, Nigeria also endorsed this declaration. So what does this do? It commits Nigeria to ensure that it integrates disability inclusion in all development programs. As I will also say shortly, we find out that when we are talking about disability, there is also the aspect that excludes women with disability. I will speak to that more as I progress with this presentation. And of course, it also recognizes the double marginalization of women and girls with disabilities. I'll speak deeply to this in the next slide that I'll be presenting on. Then when you come down to the domestic framework within Nigeria, we have the Discrimination Against Persons with Disability Prohibition Act, which also prohibits discrimination in education, healthcare, employment, and public life. And one interesting aspect of this law is the establishment of the National Commission for Persons with Disabilities. While this commission the structures are in place, it's also important to know that it is a going concern and they continue to strengthen their ability to carry out their mandate. But one major gap, which I'll be emphasizing most in the course of this presentation, is that there is no dedicated provision for women with disabilities. Protections you receive from the Disability Act looks at disability on a broad spectrum and not also recognizing the intersectionality between disability and gender rights. And that will lead me to talk about how disability intersects with gender rights, particularly as we are focusing on Nigeria at the moment. Number one, you have the issue of double jeopardy. Women with disabilities face discrimination first on grounds of gender. So when we talk about gender, there is already the issue that the fact that you're a woman, there is already a vulnerability associated with it. There is the consciousness that there are cultural sensitive issues that affect your living a normal life. So this one is the discrimination you face because you're a woman. Then in addition to that discrimination, the person is now disabled. So you have double jeopardy. So sometimes when we look at disability in Nigeria, we are looking at disability generally, but we do not recognize that women with disability face double jeopardy. First, because they are women, and second, because they are disabled. So what does this bring to the table? it brings out the unique vulnerabilities. They are at higher risk of gender-based violence. For instance, I know of a case of someone I know very well who is she's disabled. So sometimes when I had conversations with her, you discover that when the husband tries to abuse her in terms of physical beating or assault on the woman, she's unable to even because she has disability in terms of movement. One of her legs is disabled, so she's unable to even defend herself. If she's fully able, maybe if the man is trying to hit her, she'll be able to run away or be able to defend herself. But her disability places her at the higher risk of gender-based violence because once the man pins her to a corner, she cannot even defend herself, much more than someone who is not having that challenge would have been able to do in that circumstance. So this is a unique vulnerability. So it makes them at higher risk of gender-based violence. We also have issues of economic marginalization. Sometimes you find also that such women are unable to access employment because of their conditions. And as a result of that, there is also that economic marginalization and exclusion from services. Some of them go to institutions with mandates to protect them. But when they visit those institutions, you don't have those access support that will enable them to even access those institutions. So, for instance, you have people on wheelchair getting into an institution. There is no section for disabled persons to be able to access. So, imagine a woman who has just faced domestic violence coming out to report and unable to even access the facility that should help her. So, you see that this is also a unique vulnerability that excludes them from those services. I've already talked about public services. They are excluded from accessing public services. When you go to our hospitals, you also find that these issues are very much prevalent, where they are unable to receive the care that they deserve because of the challenges in those places, making it impossible for them to be able to access such services or access any form of support that they require, for which they seek those services. Then another one that is also important for us to consider that is a major issue in Nigeria is access to justice. Barriers. For instance, most if you go to the police stations, you don't find sign language experts or interpreters who are able to help such persons report their cases effectively. Such facilities are not available in most of our justice sector, police stations, even the courts, maybe on special arrangements, you can have that. Facilities are not accessible. You also have the issue of stigma around. Then you come down to cultural perceptions and stigma. Already, as a woman, there is also that cultural perception and stigma associated with it. But then when you now add disability to it, you see that it becomes higher and more exacerbated, becoming more difficult for such persons to live a normal life within the society. And of course, you also know that when a woman is disabled, of course, there is somehow how it applies also to the children. Some people use the identity of the parents to begin to also look at the children. So this affects the impact it has on the children. Once the mother is suffering, the suffering also extends to children around them and of course those who are within that area. So you find out that there is intergenerational impact when it comes to do with the intersection of disability and gender rights in Nigeria. As I begin to conclude, because I'm being mindful of time, I just want to identify a few gaps and then we look at a pathway to how we can resolve such issues. When you look at the international and regional legal framework for disability protection, you will discover that it recognizes this intersection very well. You have the issues of the unique vulnerabilities of women recognized in those frameworks. You have the gender-sensitive protections properly recognized in those frameworks. But when you come to Nigeria to our domestic framework, you see that it does not fully recognize these intersections. So when you look at the Disability Act, it addresses issues of disability broadly. It does not recognize the specific nature of women with disability to provide some special protection. Now, if you also look at the programs by the institutions that with the responsibility of implementing the Disability Act, you find that most of their programs do not also tailor itself towards the realities that women with disabilities face. So you find that in policy design and implementation, women with disabilities remain clearly invisible. And then you also find that this is a very technical area when you talk about gender-based violence and disability. So when you find most policy formulations or programming done around interventions for disability rights, you don't find organizations with mandates for GBV brought on the table to discuss. Of course, when you have them on the table, the insights and perspectives they will bring to the table, we definitely have to ensure that those programs are tailored towards protecting the interests of women with disabilities. But oftentimes, you don't find them on the table. So which pathway should we follow in trying to resolve these issues? Number one, we don't need new laws. We have enough laws in place to be able to protect. All we need is to leverage upon existing commitments. We have ratified the Disability Protocol, which also recognizes women with disabilities. We have also endorsed the Amman-Berlin Declaration, which also provides a framework that allows for inclusion of women with disabilities. So what we must now do is to find ways to integrate gender-sensitive policies into disability programs. Find ways to begin to piece these points together to ensure that programs for disability persons will have to recognize the unique vulnerabilities faced by women with disability. We need to ensure that our service agencies, and by that I mean our healthcare services, our educational sector, the public institutions, they are all inclusive in approach, in their protocols. There should be protocols in place to help them respond to these issues. And when I talk about protocols, for instance, we need to build the capacity of law enforcement agencies to recognize the special nature of cases of GBV so that they know how to respond to them. Most of them treat it as a general case. So when you come, you see that the woman leaves such a place even more violated than when she came. So there is need for those who work in these places to be trained. There is need for also for us to have in our service agencies and public sector assistive technologies and provide interpreters, especially in our police stations, to encourage access to justice. There is also a need for us to have guidelines and protocols. Because most of these institutions, once you say these things, they understand them, but they don't even know how to begin to implement them together. So there is need for critical stakeholders, relevant stakeholders to come together for us to develop guidelines and protocols that will support this inclusion. Not just talking about it, but being able to help them technically to know that once you follow these guidelines, you're able to provide the assistance that will provide some level of support to women with disabilities and also reduce the impact of gender-based violence on them. And of course, we believe that when this is done, to be able to address the intersections, how this violates rights, there's also need for us to begin to consider developing policy briefs on how this intersection happens, the intersectionality between GBV and disability. This policy brief will be able to help policymakers in Nigeria to understand how this intersects and also for them to do programming that will be able to address these issues when they occur. And I'll conclude by saying that gender-based violence is a systemic human rights violation. Sometimes we look at the harm it causes, but we don't also recognize the corresponding human rights violation. So there is need in forums like this as we continue this conversation to look at making it more inclusive, data-driven, and rights-based to ensure that women's rights, especially for those with disabilities, are fully protected in Nigeria. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ben Okoro, for that comprehensive and eye-opening presentation. And from your presentation, we understand what GBV is, the forms of GBV, and you also shared an insight on the legal and international frameworks for gender-based violence. And we can see from that that there's gap and there's need to fill the gap, and we can see that there's no dedicated provisions for women with disabilities based on protections, and we can see that they are broad and generic. So it's something to be considered to fill that gap. And also the data and insights that you've shared, it underscores the urgent need for action. And we can see that there is also urgent need for inclusive, data-driven and insight-based solutions. So thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Um, all right, so I'm proceeding to the next presentation. um, I have our next speaker is Dr. Anwuli Ofuani Sokolo. Please pardon me if I pronounce that wrongly. So I would take a bio before I hand over the mic to her. All right, Dr. Anwuli Ofuani. She's an associate professor at the University of Benin, whose expertise spans law, gender, and social justice. So Dr. Anwuli Irene is an associate professor in the Department of Private and Property Law at the University of Benin, Nigeria. Her teaching career spans over 17 years of teaching and research in the field of private law, human rights, disability rights, and gender justice. Dr. Ofuani Sokolo holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Benin, a Master of Laws in Marine and Environmental Law from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Human Rights with a specialization in disability rights from the University of Pretoria. She was called to the Nigerian bar in 2006. Her research lies at the intersection of law, disability, and gender, where she critically examines how legal systems can empower, protect, and transform the lived experiences of vulnerable populations. She has authored and co-authored numerous publications in national and international journals, contributing significant insights to the ongoing discourse on disability rights, equality, inclusion, and social justice. Dr. Ofuani Sokolo has participated widely in conferences, workshops, training programs, and specialized courses on disability and human rights, further strengthening her profile as both a researcher and an advocate for inclusive legal reform. I want to welcome Dr. Anwuli to kindly proceed with that presentation. You have 15 minutes, Ma. Thank you. Over to you.
Please can you share the screen? Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here and to talk about something that is dear to my heart, talking about inclusion of persons with disabilities, particularly women with disabilities. Please, can you hear me? I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, we can, clearly.
Okay, thank you. So, as a member of the committee, I'm a member of the committee as well. I was very, very pleased to be invited to talk on the topic. So basically, I'm going to be focusing on violence against women and girls with disabilities in Nigeria. I want to thank Dr. Ben Okoro because he made my work really easy. He has made my work kind of easy because he has highlighted some of the things I'll be discussing. So when I get to such areas, I'll just mention and skip. So the first thing to note is the first thing to understand and setting the context is understanding who persons with disabilities are. First of all, understanding what disability is. And disability is referred to as a long-term physical, mental, intellectual, sensory, or psychosocial impairment. What this means is that people that we call physically challenged, using the wrong words, crippled, lame, mad. I'm just trying to look for the late terms that we use, which are we consider derogatory in the disability rights parlance. people that we say are they don't have reasoning. I'm just trying to use Nigerian terms. Are covered under disability. But what is important is not just their impairment that disables them, it's their impairment in combination with social barriers and environmental barriers. So where a place is not accessible, it's not just because the person does not have, because the person has physical impairment, or the person, for instance, or because the person has visual impairment, the person is blind, for instance. It is because there are social barriers, attitudinal problems, and environmental barriers that also, make sure that that person is further disabled in society, limiting the person's ability to participate in society on an equal basis with other persons. So when Dr. Ben Okoro was sharing his, was making his presentation, he gave a lot of data. But if I were to ask how much of the data is focused on women with disabilities, you're going to find out that there's little or none, and that's one of the problems we face in Nigeria when it comes to women, generally persons with disabilities and women with disabilities. National estimates say that we have 25 million persons with disabilities, and then we know that women constitute a very large portion of that population, but we don't have specific data on the number of women and persons with disabilities in Nigeria. Like I said, in Nigeria, the disability ranges from physical impairment, visual impairment, hearing impairment, intellectual impairment, psychosocial impairment, and neurodevelopmental impairment, such as autism. And then, of course, we have people who have what we call multiple disabilities. They may have more than one form of disabilities in Nigeria. And from what research has said, the UN says, and UN and many NGOs in Nigeria have stated that women with disabilities, we understand that women generally are very, very vulnerable to violence, different forms of violence, but women with disabilities are at least twice or 3 times more likely to experience violence than their non-disabled counterparts. And these acts are perpetrated by family members, intimate partners, caregivers, and then, of course, institutions that provide services to them. And then when we talk about intersectionality, as has been highlighted by Dr. Ben Okoro, you find out that when disability intersects with gender inequality, ableism, when we're talking about the fact that people believe that persons with disabilities are not as superior as persons with disabilities because of their disability. That's what ableism means. When it intersects with such issues, gender roles that are assigned in society, it intersects with power dynamics, poverty. It increases the women with disabilities susceptibility to discrimination, and of course violence. And so you find out that sometimes when these things happen, women with disabilities face double or triple forms, of disability. You call it double jeopardy. So you find double or triple jeopardy when it comes to intersecting factors that intersect with disability for women with disabilities. And this violence occurs in multiple levels, at home, institutions, and then surprisingly from family and caregivers. And some of the problems include underreporting and, of course, lack of data. So when we look at the legal framework, we have, like as highlighted by Dr. Ben Okoro, but one of the key important international framework is the CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And when you look at the convention, it prohibits discrimination in all areas of life. Talking about healthcare, the family, all areas of life, social areas, economic areas, it prohibits discrimination. And this is when you look at Section 3 of the Article 3 of the Convention, that clearly highlights it. But it specifically provides for, it specifically prohibits violence and exploitation of women with disabilities in Section 16, in Article 16, sorry. And then it also prohibits degrading treatment, inhumane and degrading treatment, all of which violence against women fall under. When we talk about the African Disability Protocol, which he also highlighted, the same thing, it prohibits discrimination in all areas of aspects of life. Then it also goes further to it contains specific, just like the CRPD, which also contains specific provisions for women with disabilities, prohibiting discrimination against women with disabilities. The African Disability Protocol takes it further. It brings it in the African context, and it actually mentions specific issues that affect women with disabilities, like ritual killings, and it prohibits those kind of things. And then, of course, it prohibits violence against women and exploitation of women. It also prohibits exploitation of children with disabilities, violence against children with disabilities in Article 28. So it contains dedicated provisions prohibiting violence against women. When you come down to the Nigerian context, our constitution, I'm not going to dwell too much on it, all the fundamental human rights, right to human dignity, liberty, because as we are going to see as we go further in the presentation, we're going to see how all these things play out, non-discrimination, all these things are covered in the fundamental as fundamental human rights in the Nigerian constitution. Then you go to discrimination against persons with Disabilities Prohibition Act, which was highlighted by Dr. Ben Okoro. It prohibits discrimination, like he has said, in all aspects of life. But it doesn't contain any provision, like he said, on women. Neither does it prohibit violence, like the International and Regional Convention. Then the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act 2015 contains elaborate provisions, which also applies to women with disabilities, prohibiting psychological violence, sexual violence, neglect, abandonment, physical violence. It contains salient provisions, which I've highlighted if you look at my slide, section 1 to 3, up to 20. And then it also contains salient provisions prohibiting discrimination against persons. So when you look at all these things, like you said, it's not a lack of law that persists in Nigeria, perhaps poor implementation. Please, can you still hear me? I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So when we look at the causes of disabilities, we call it violence against women with disabilities in Nigeria, you find out that he has highlighted some of them. We have issues of patriarchal norms, gender stereotyping that believes that women, they belong to certain places, the kitchen, they belong to the woman's places, and is to give birth to children and stuff like that. These things are further exacerbated for women with disabilities, because problems of accessibility is a big problem there. You find out that for women with disabilities, patriarchal norms, people believe that they shouldn't get married, they should stay at home. There are beliefs that they are asexual. That means they cannot experience sexual pleasure, they can't have children. So these things further, disable women with disabilities, like we said, the double jeopardy. Then we have stigma and misconceptions about disabilities. There are a lot of negative beliefs and myths about disability, seeing disability as a cause, as a burden, or as a punishment from the gods, which some of these things still persist. And this stigma has make it harder for women with disabilities to live in society, because it leads to isolation and vulnerability. And then, like Dr. Ben Okoro aptly highlighted, sometimes it extends to their family, because if a family member has a disability, it also trickles down to the family members. Then we find out that another cause of violence is economic dependence. Many women with disabilities depend on their family members for economic sustenance, because first of all, we find out that there are even little jobs, and even when jobs are available to them, most of the times the workplace is inaccessible. They can't access it because there are no, for instance, for women with physical disabilities, you don't find ramps or lifts or elevators there or escalators. For women with visual impairment, you don't find the right materials, braille materials for them to use to do their work, or the right technology. For women with hearing impairment, you don't find adequate sign language interpreters. So these things further make it difficult for them to access the workplace, making their dependence on others, very, very, very inescapable, and then often trapping them in abusive situations. Even when they are being abused or they are exposed to violence, they can't leave because they depend on their abuser or the perpetrator of violence against them for financial support and care and shelter. Then, of course, we know that there's limited education. You find from my research, because I find out that many girls with disabilities are denied the opportunity to go to school. Sometimes parents prefer to take them for vocational training, and even that is very, very limited. And so without education, they can't even understand and access their rights. And then, of course, they don't even know how to seek help when they have little other information on how to seek help when abuse and violence occurs. And of course, perpetrators know this and they exploit this gap. Then he has highlighted that persons with disability, also has highlighted the invisibility of persons with disabilities, women with disabilities, in policy and service delivery. Like I highlighted, data about persons with disabilities generally in Nigeria is not reliable. And then, of course, on women with disabilities, it's very, 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 very limited. You can't find little or no data on women with disabilities. And so they are usually not consulted in decision making when it comes to issues of gender-based violence or national gender policies. They don't involve women with disabilities. And how can you get the perspective of women? How can you know how to protect women with disabilities when their voices are not heard? And so they're usually invisible when it comes to such issues, and they remain hidden, and systems meant to protect them also fail to respond adequately to their needs. And then, of course, we have caregiver dependence. Most women with disabilities depend on their caregivers for mobility, to move around, for communication, for transportation, for their daily routines, for medication. And so there's a power imbalance that is created. And usually that power imbalance is usually exploited, and they usually face neglect, exploitation, abuse, and reporting. And it creates a very, very important, difficult dynamic, because reporting your caregiver is a very difficult thing to do, because you know that you rely on the person, and after you report, what next? You don't have adequate policy mechanisms to address such issues. So many times, much often or not, they don't, they don't report such abuse by their caregivers. And then, of course, we have adequate laws, but these laws are not being implemented with enforcement of laws. And then, of course, we know that the adequate stakeholders are not adequately trained when it comes to issues of disability. The courts are not adequately trained. The police, even lawyers, are not adequately trained. And without this training, without training on how to, deal with persons with disabilities, ensuring implementation of laws just becomes, it becomes very, very weak, because there are no accountability measures in place. And so this makes perpetrators and, emboldened to continue their acts. And then, of course, we have lack of inclusive gender-based services. Many of our shelters, the police station, our health centers are not disability friendly at all. A person with disability usually finds physical barriers, communication barriers, and then, of course, information barriers when it comes to accessing gender-based services. Even when they are there, when the shelters are there, or the police, of course, we know the police is there, these barriers, make women with disabilities unable to get help when they face violence, because these services are not inclusive. And so it ensures that violence goes unreported and unpunished in most cases. Can you still hear me? I just want to be sure you can hear me still.
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So these are the issues these are the causes of, violence against women in Nigeria. And then as we go further, you find out that, okay, now we're going to be looking at different types of violence. Not just to say something, women with disabilities and women without disabilities face the same forms of violence. But for women with disabilities, there are some issues that make it even worse, make them worse off than women without disabilities. And we're going to be looking at some of these issues. So the first form of violence, like I said, I'll be focusing on violence, is physical violence. And physical violence basically just means the intentional use of force to cause harm, injury, or even death to a person. And then, of course, it includes acts that we know of: beatings, punching, killings. But for women with disabilities, there are peculiar forms of physical violence that usually applies to them only. And one of such is locking them out of sight. It's only persons with disabilities that are usually locked out of sight or constrained in their homes, away from sight, because we believe that people should not see them, and so they are hidden from society. And they're usually, in some homes, they're actually physically restrained. And then it's also women with disabilities, that are restrained in psychiatric, people that suffer psychosocial disabilities that are often physically restrained in psychiatric institutions. And then when it comes to ritual killings, yeah, we know ritual killings, applies to everybody, but there's this belief that when you use persons with disabilities all over Africa, not just Nigeria, that for those that are looking for money, it just enhances the rituals. And so they are more susceptible to ritual killings than the average person. And then they are also more susceptible to reproductive and health-related violence, such as forced sterilization, where they are made, their right to fertility is hindered because parents fear that because they are susceptible to gender-based violence, they can also become pregnant, and that's additional burden on parents. So parents subject them to forced sterilization or forced contraception, where they are forcefully given contraception, or their right to give birth to children is taken away from them forever. They are most likely not to also get married in the home. They are most likely to be kept at home because of their disabilities. In addition to this, they face certain barriers when it comes to healthcare, abuses, which we're going to come to, and then of course, lack of accessible information, lack of accessible infrastructure. For women with physical disabilities, there are certain beds that should be provided for them, but you find out that in most healthcare institutions in Nigeria, they are lacking, even toilet facilities. And so these things, I had a conversation with a woman recently who said when she went for antenatal, she was pressed and she couldn't access the toilet, and she ended up soiling herself, and then was even in
It seems we lost her. I think that should be network issues.
As simple as finding information about where to go to in hospitals, what to do is difficult, especially for, depending on the type of disability. People with visual impairment lack braille, persons with hearing impairment, no sign language interpreters, and that just further, exacerbates these issues. We also have sexual violence, which is the most pervasive form of violence against women with disabilities in Nigeria today. I don't know if some of you saw the video, some video that was trending some weeks ago on Instagram about a girl who has intellectual disability and is also physically impaired. She was crawling, and then she was sexually abused by a neighbor, up to the extent that she's gotten pregnant. And when she was being questioned, she wasn't which is a problem for persons with intellectual disabilities. Reporting is a problem, giving their own account is a problem. She was saying that while she was baiting, the person will come in and assault her every time she goes to bait. And the mother was saying, oh, she knows the person, but how would they prosecute the person? That's part of the lack of awareness of rights that I highlighted earlier on. So like I said, anything that humiliates or degrades a person sexually, or forces a person to enter sexual acts, that's what we're talking about here. And like I said, it is one of the most pervasive forms of violence against women with disabilities. It includes rape, coerced, sexual acts, sexual manipulation, forced prostitution. Yes, they use persons with disabilities in prostitution, they force them.
and then exploitation for favors or sexual assault. And most of the time, it is usually committed by caregivers or community members, and even in some cases, service providers. And for women with intellectual disabilities, they are usually targeted because it is believed that they cannot communicate or report what happened to them. And then, of course, that they will not be believed. And then there's this stereotype that women with intellectual disabilities are very, very sexually promiscuous, which is wrong. But so because of this negative stereotypes, they are not believed. Getting justice for them is not believed. And we know all these things also violate their right to bodily autonomy. Then we'll come up to talk about psychological abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, the use of constant degrading language, threatening to abandon. Yeah, these are things that women with disabilities face. Threatening, we know that women without disabilities face them, but for women with disabilities, it's a daily reality. Threats of abandonment, people telling them they are not worthless, making them feel like burden. And then, of course, one of the most common forms of psychological abuse, controlling interactions and communication. Caregivers usually have the power to control who persons with disabilities interact with and communicate with. And so this is a big issue when it comes to violence. And then we also have economic violence, where a woman's ability to acquire, use, and maintain her economic resources is being hindered, and it threatens her economic security, and of course, potential for self-sufficiency. And it involves not allowing women with disability to work, or appropriating their earnings or disability benefits, controlling their transportation and their mobility, denying them access to assistive services so that they are unable to work, exploiting, their labor, using them for exploitative labor. We see people using persons with disability to beg. And then, of course, the persons who use them to beg collect the money. And then, of course, perpetuating financial dependence so that they cannot leave their caregivers or the perpetrators of violence. And of course, we know that without economic independence, living a violent situation becomes almost impossible. And then, of course, I've highlighted some of these things: institutional and structural violence, lack of ramps, lack of sign language interpreters, lack of trained personnel in public service providers, like courts, like police stations, like hospitals, like transportations, like gender-based violence shelters, like schools and workplaces. So this institutional and structural violence, just ensures that systemic discrimination is heightened for women with disabilities. Can you still hear me? Sorry, I'll keep asking because everywhere is just silent. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So as we have seen, when you see, like I said, women with disabilities face some of the same kind of violence as women without disabilities, but there are some form of violence that are specific to them, like I highlighted. So what do we do? What are the strategies to ensure that women with disabilities, we address violence against women with disabilities? And one of them is the strengthening enforcement of laws. And when we are talking about strengthening enforcement of laws, we're talking about ensuring that we train the personnel involved in justice delivery, the courts. There's need to train judges and court staff regularly on disability inclusion and disability issues. There's need to train police officers, maybe probably having help desks at the police stations, because they are the first points of contact where there's violence. They're the first places persons would, tend to report incidents of violence. So it's very important to strengthen enforcement, and of course, strengthen both the National Commission for Persons with Disability, and of course the various state commissions, to ensure that protection of women with disabilities from violence is better served, because they are the first point of contact. One of the things they are mandated to do is receive complaints of abuses, and so when they are strengthened, when they are trained, this just makes issues of violence to be better addressed. Then, of course, we know that persons with disabilities themselves and the general public, many people do not know about disability issues. We don't understand disability issues. So there's need to conduct awareness raising programs. This is where NGOs come in and disability rights advocacy groups come in to ensure that persons, they create awareness in society so that we can understand not just disability issues, but where we see incidents of violence occurring, we know where to report, because many of the incidents, that we have seen in disability advocacy, reports of incidents of violence come from not just persons with disabilities themselves, but neighbors who report. There was an incident where a child with Down syndrome was being chained somewhere in the house by his parents and left for days. And it was a neighbor that reported that it seemed like that issue was being, somebody was being abused in that house. And then upon investigation, it was found that the child was chained by the parents and left in very, very deplorable state. So those kind of things, if there's awareness, persons in society will know how to go about, addressing issues or reporting issues of violence against women with disabilities. Then accessibility of services. I highlighted that in my presentation, and Dr. Ben Okoro highlighted this. So I'm not just going to say much about it. I'll just say that if services are accessible, it just makes reporting incidents of violence easier. Capacity building, I've also talked about when I was talking about strengthening of laws. Economic empowerment. There's need to create jobs for persons with disabilities. This is where NGOs and the government come in. You need to empower them both at the formal level and informal level. The Discrimination Against Persons with Disability Prohibition Act talks about employing persons with disabilities in government institutions, but we know that this is hardly being done. And so how can persons with disabilities attain economic independence and to be able to flee situations of economic abuse and just general violence when they cannot access jobs, both formal and informal jobs? Then it is also very important for data to be collected. As a researcher, one of the most difficult things to do when we are to do or to get is information about persons with disabilities. Most times we have to create data, so we have to now conduct our own research before we can get a little data. And most times the research is usually limited to a small area. Like for instance, most of my research is conducted in Edo State, where my university is based. So you can't get a large picture of incidents of violence, issues that affect persons with disabilities in general, and then women with disabilities in particular. Getting data on these issues is almost impossible in Nigeria because we don't have adequate data. And I think that is one of the things that the commission should be set to do, ensuring that probably, and then maybe the Human Rights Commission as well, collecting, disability data. It's very, very important if we're going to address issues of gender-based violence against women with disabilities. And of course, it requires multi-stakeholder collaboration. We cannot leave women with disabilities on their own. It involves you and I. It involves the police. It involves, academia, industry. It involves NGOs. Everybody coming together to ensure that we collaborate, whether it's in terms of data collection, whether it's in terms of awareness creation, whether it's in terms of ensuring accessibility of services, capacity building, economic empowerment. It involves everybody coming together to ensure that, issues of disability, generally, and then of course, violence against women, we collaborate to ensure that these issues are addressed in one way or the other. So in conclusion, I just want to say that violence against women with disabilities is more than a women's rights issues. It's not just a women's rights issues, as highlighted by Dr. Ben Okoro. Neither is just a disability issue. It's a human rights issue because it touches on many of the fundamental human rights recognized in the Constitution: right to human dignity, right to non-discrimination, right to liberty, because constraining a person against his will amount to that. Infringement of that right. So if we want to ensure that we address violence against women with disabilities adequately, it involves a responsive approach. It involves awareness creating. It involves the development of strong systems and institutions. It involves inclusive laws, because we have laws in paper, but you find out that these laws are not as inclusive as they should be to ensure that disability issues are included. And then, of course, it involves collective action between you and I. So in line with these 16 days of activism that is going to end tomorrow, measures to address gender-based violence against women must include all women, not just some groups of women. It must include all women, including persons and women and girls with disabilities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anwuli, for that insightful presentation. As we can see, we are running behind schedule. So just to give a wrap up on our presentation. So we understand our framework is essential for identifying where reforms are most urgently needed. And then she shared about the intersectionality of disability and gender rights in Nigeria. And we can see that women with disabilities, they face double jeopardy, where they face discrimination on both gender and disability grounds, and that makes them more vulnerable. She also highlighted the causes of violence against women in Nigeria, where we can see stigma and cultural beliefs attached to women with disabilities, and then they have poor accessibility services, limited education and awareness of their rights, and even if they want to report, where do they do that? How do they get justice? These are the questions that are limiting them and making them more vulnerable. And then also she spoke on invisibility in policy, which was also mentioned by Dr. Obiora. So, and we can see that women with disability, their rights are not included. They are not. They are hidden. They cannot be seen in decision making and policies, and their voices are not heard. If they are not included in policies, then how do we want to address all of these issues? So, thank you so much for that. Great presentation. So quickly, I would be running into the third presentation. And as we are running out of time, I would quickly call on the last speaker, um, who is Miss Oluwaseun Osowobi. I'm sorry if that was not pronounced well. Um, and she's the executive director of Stand to End Rape Initiative, which is one of Nigeria's leading organizations combating sexual violence and supporting survivors. So I would run through a bio quickly. Oluwaseun Ayodeji Osowobi is a multi-award winning gender equality advocate with 8 years of experience in deploying effective solutions to challenge systemic social barriers that promote violence against women and girls. She is a young leader for the Sustainable Development Goals endorsed by the UN and Executive Director of Stand to End Rape Initiative, a leading NGO that adopts a comprehensive approach to working with communities to generate sustainable homegrown solutions and partners with local and national groups on system level prevention and intervention while providing holistic psychosocial support to survivors in Nigeria. In 2019, Oluwaseun partnered with BBC Africa Eye on the Sex for Grades documentary to highlight sexual harassment in Nigerian tertiary institutions. Through this effort, the Sexual Harassment in Tertiary Institution Prohibition Bill was relaunched at the National Assembly and passed the third reading. In recognition of her work, Oluwaseun was named the Commonwealth Young Person for the Year 2019, Time 100 next, and awarded the 2020 Global Citizen Prize, Nigeria's Hero Award. So I want to welcome Ms. Oluwaseun Ayodeji to go ahead with her presentation. Thank you. I think she would be projecting on her side. Ms. Oluwaseun, you have the floor. You have 15 minutes, but we're running out of schedule. Please, can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All
Good
right, so
afternoon,
we are
ma'am.
waiting for Miss Oluwashio. I'm not sure if she's on the call. All right, so before she comes up, I would like to encourage everyone to drop their questions in the chat box so that we can quickly run through that as we are behind schedule for time. So if you have any question for the two previous speakers, please kindly drop the questions in the chat box and we will take them accordingly. Thank you. Ms. Oluwaseun, we are still waiting for you.
Hi, Jumoke, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Jumoke, okay, I would suggest we just proceed with the
All right.
question and answer session.
All
It
right.
appears she's not here.
All right. Thank you so much, Adenike. So we'll proceed to the question and answer section. So since we don't have any question in the chat box for now, I would just give the floor to anyone who has questions to unmute and go ahead with their questions for the two speakers. So please, if you have questions, you can raise your virtual hand and then unmute.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. You can
Thank
go
you very
ahead.
much. Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed the both speakers. My comments is related to the second speech. I'm curious about data collection as one of the measures to show support to participate in creating promoting the rights for disabled women. She mentioned that part of her role in University of Benin involves a lot of data collection. I'm really curious as to how that works specifically for regarding this topic.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. You have the floor.
Okay, so one of the, like I said, one of the things I am doing in the course of my research is trying to conduct evidence-based research where, you know, when we're talking about issues, we can back them up with, you know, data, evidence-based data. And so when you're talking about issues of gender-based violence, I conducted a research that had to do, not basically on gender-based violence per se, but we're looking at support in the context of the CRPD, you know, support for persons with disabilities. And one of the things we looked at was how is support provided for persons, women with disabilities generally, when issues of violence occur. And so we had to ask questions like, have you ever been involved in violence? So like I said, it's data collection is very important so that you know how to address, you know, what kind of violence is occurring, right? That's how we knew that sexual-based violence is the most pervasive, not just my research, but research from other NGOs. And then when you know the most, you know, the kind of, the forms of violence that are persisting, you also are able, from data, you're able to draw up responsive measures to address this issue. So data collection is very important because you need to know, first of all, what is happening. you know, before you can address what is happening. You cannot assume that, oh, every woman with disability is facing violence, or women with disabilities don't face violence, or, you know, so we need, so data is very important in addressing issues of gender-based violence. Also, while I'm considering, we're also, me and my colleagues are also involved in a TED Fund-based program, or sorry, research on accessibility. And while I was talking to one of the students, because I had a focus group discussion with the students, a male student, I mean, I know it doesn't relate to our topic, but you know, it was just very important to understand. A male student talked about how he experienced violence in the hands of other students, people pushing him away, people targeting him in his bed space, you know, attacking, that he experienced various forms of attacks as a student in one of the hostels. And then it took him reporting before he was moved to another hostel, where I think efforts were made to know, porters were told to look in on him regularly. And I asked him, how has that been now? And he said, things have improved. So it's through data you can get this information, because there's usually this perception that it's only women with disabilities. But I found it interesting to know that a young man with disability was also victim. So data is very important for you to address, for there to be an inclusive, gender responsive, disability responsive program or measure. In all the data, Dr. Okoro, I may be wrong, but you know, all those data that was presented, when you ask how many percentage of that data involves women, you will find out that very little or not. And so how do you make policies that will be responsive when you don't know the target audience? You don't know what kind of responses are needed to address that issue. I hope I've made sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I say good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Yeah, my name is Titi Afusa, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Women's Committee. So thank you. I want to thank all the speakers for a very insightful presentation. And maybe my question will just roll from the last question in terms of laws and policies with women with disability or persons with disability. Don't let me just say only women, because I want to believe that there is a particular way in which violence is perpetrated on this set of people. Now, do you really think that we need a targeted law, really to target people with disability when it comes to gender-based violence in Nigeria? And then I want to ask also, the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act 2015, do we really have some provisions there that actually target people with disability, looking at the different kinds of disability that they have? So these are things that I hear you say a few things that have happened to people with disability, somebody that is violating her while she's going into the bathroom in the morning. So these are issues. And because of her situation, she may not be able to shout, she may not be able to tell adequately who actually violated her. So do you really think we need a targeted law, just the way we are trying to put up another law to address gender-based violence in the university setting? Thank you.
Okay, so I think targeted, for me, I'm not a fan of fragmentation because it just creates problem. But the problem is when the gender-based violence policies and laws are made in place, if we have said it, you find out that they are too generic. So they don't take into consideration the specific needs or the unique perceptions of, or the unique position of persons with disabilities. So what works for me will definitely not work for a woman with hearing impairment, for instance. And so if these laws are not deliberate, so we can have one law, I mean, but if the law now brings in a disability perspective, I mean, I think that's fine. But why eventually we advocate for targeted laws is because most of the gender-based laws and policies are not inclusive. They don't include persons with disabilities. And so you find out persons with disabilities many times have to fight, because I am I'm kind of like an associate member of JONAPID, and I'm on the board of one of the disability associations in Benin City, NAPVID. And so we find out that they have to now fight to get a seat at the table, and then they start advocating for their own laws, because the general law. So if we're going to be, aside for those of us who do policies, if you look at the VAPP Act, it's general. There's nothing specific about persons with disabilities. You look at, I can bet you that the sexual, what they call it now, the sexual harassment in tertiary institution, the Act, you will find out that it doesn't take into consideration the unique positions of persons with disabilities. And so that is why we eventually now start advocating. But if from day one, as we're making gender-based policies, we're trying to, be inclusive. We're looking at including vulnerable women. And when we're saying we're looking at, vulnerable women are vulnerable, but women, are we including women in the women with disabilities, or other women, maybe displaced women? If we take into consideration everybody's unique needs, I think one law will be able to capture everything. I mean, that's my view. But because we don't usually do that, that is where we now start asking for targeted responses or targeted laws. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Just one follow-up question. For both of you, please, I really need an insight from both of you. So in our women committee, it's very, very important that we also address some of these things you have put in place. And I'm sure that's the reason why we have this webinar. For us in women's committee, what will be your recommendations in terms of what we could do as women's committee to address some of the issues both of you have raised? Thank you. Because we want to move forward from this webinar, not just to talk about it, but also to do something concrete to actually make impact in the society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you
All
hear
right,
me?
I don't know. Okay. Thank you. Yes, you have the floor, sir.
Let me relieve Dr. Amole a bit. She has been speaking, so let me just start and then she'll come in at some point. Just to thank Dr. Amole for the wonderful presentation and also for some of the perspectives that she has shared, which also aligns with my view. And I will just speak generally to some of the issues that have been raised because of the questions. Data is important. Data, they say, is life, because data helps us to channel our interventions to what we need to do. Data is important because it helps us to measure our interventions. While Dr. Wuli was speaking, she talked about the fact that it's not just women that face issues, not just women with disability that face issues of violations, but data will be able to tell you that women face it more than men. So it helps to know how to engage with issues. And irrespective of the data I shared, it looks at women generally. If you go to the NHRC website, www.nhrc.gov.ng, you will see the human rights situation, that presentation from January to October. So you might want to also look at that. You might find something relevant. And I think the issues have been raised already about the need to also begin to disaggregate this data and to begin to talk about it. One of the forums when the presentation was being made, some persons with disability raised the issue that we need to begin to bring out data on how it affects persons with disabilities, so that we begin to bring up those issues for proper engagement, which I also agree with. I also align with Dr. Anwuli to the extent that we don't need new laws. There is no need for fragmentation of laws. What we have on ground is enough for us to begin to protect all these category of persons. It's important that we know that the challenge we have basically first is that the policy makers do not understand these things. And of course, it will affect the policy they bring out. It will also affect the implementation of those policies. If they don't understand how these violations intersect, to be difficult. Sometimes when decisions or policy is being formed, you find out that the people around the table don't have the knowledge. Just imagine that somebody like Dr. Anwuli now is within that forum. just hearing these perspectives will definitely change the direction of policies that will come out from such meetings. But unfortunately, such persons are not within the table. When these policies are about to be brought out, you see people begin to look at interest. Already, even the National Commission for Persons with Disabilities already hearing issues regarding interest. What is really their interest? They're talking about budget and then how it's being implemented. There are a lot of issues. I was in a forum and these were the things coming out, even among the persons with disabilities. So you see that we don't focus on the things that matter, and it's really a challenge, and it affects implementation. So I don't think we need to have specific laws, because if we start fragmenting laws very soon, we start talking about children with disability, we have a new law for them. Unborn children with disability, we have new law for them, and of course, these things continue to increase. And at some point, there was a time I was talking about environmental laws. It was difficult for me to list all the environmental laws we have in Nigeria because there are too many, and it's now started confusing people. We don't even know the one to relate to, and we have laws affecting almost everything, but we are not able to implement. So I think this now takes me to my recommendation, and I think we need to start looking at our programming and our policies. Policies in the sense that, of course, before you start talking about programming, you need to also look at the policies that come out. And where this committee can come in is you have already started with this kind of conversation. And if we're having these conversations, I think it's important to also reach out to the relevant stakeholders to be part of it. It would have been an opportunity for them to be sensitized more and for the issues to increase. So when we're having webinars like this, let us extend invitations as far as possible to the stakeholders that matter, those who are in the policy, and those who it comes within their mandate to ensure that these things are done. They need to be within these circles to know and understand how these things operate. And then in programming, it is also important that we begin to find ways to ensure that the right people are on the table. And the only way we can do this is to raise awareness to the people that matter. So my immediate recommendation would be for us to develop a structure where we can also bring out policy briefs. I've seen that it's something that is helping a lot of interventions. We all support policy brief writing. When you do research, somebody like Dr. Amuni would have done a lot of research, but policymakers don't have the time to read findings and outcomes. So you find that when they look at such huge documents, I met with an attorney general of one of the states when we were trying to talk about business and human rights. And once I got to his office, because we are trying to see how we can champion for the states to adopt a state level policy structure to encourage business and human rights. He told me to tell him what business and human rights is all about in less than 2 minutes. That he doesn't really have time to look at big documents. So you see that they don't read this research, but a policy brief is very brief or speaks to the issue. So if we have these policy briefs and we send it and send it to the people that matter, they can read it briefly, and you really cannot tell how much this can influence the process. I think for me, this would be my recommendation, that we start from there, bring them to discussions like this, and also be able to bring a policy brief and publish it. And you will see that when people read it, of course, somehow it will begin to influence the policy. I think Dr. Anwole can come in now to make our own contribution.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Obiora. You have said basically all I would like to say, but just to just add one thing. What the women committees could do is build alliances with organizations of persons with disabilities, because like I told you, one of my recommendations was that it involves collaboration, multi-stakeholder collaboration. Who better to help guide policy making than persons who are elected themselves? So I think that's just one of the things, in addition to all Dr. Obiora has said, is, partnering with persons with disability, probably having a woman with disability in the committee, and then not assuming that because she's a woman with disability, she speaks for all women, because that's one of the problems in Nigeria. We tend to use a one-size-fits approach. And when we disabuse our mind of that one-size-fits approach and trying to see that even for the women with disabilities, we are all not, every woman is not the same. So, we're not a homogeneous group. We all differ in status and, economic empowerment and so on and so forth. So we have to ensure that, stakeholders are brought into the table. So having a woman with disability in the community will be in the committee will be a right step in the right direction. And then, of course, working with disabled persons organizations, I think, would enrich the work of the community and, of course, ensuring accessibility. Because I'm just going to say one thing. There's a thin line between ability and disability, and people may disagree, but for my friends, for a lot of people who know me here, you will recall that for a year plus, I had a fracture, a very bad fracture that rendered me incapacitated for a very long time, for almost 18 months. I couldn't walk, and I found out firsthand how some of these things I'm talking about actually apply in practice. Hospitals were grossly inaccessible to me. I couldn't access most of the hospitals I was going to, and it was always an ordeal. I used to dread going for my checkups because I know that I was going to suffer. I was going to walk, and using my crutches and at a point I was using a walking stick at some point too. It was hell moving around the hospitals. I know how government hospitals are. One where you pay is sited in a different place, where you go to see the doctor, it was hell. There was a day I even broke down in tears because I was exhausted by the time, and that's somebody's reality every day. So we just need to talk about, we have to ensure that we create accessible space. Dr. Obiora was right. I extended invitations to some of the disabled organizations I work with, but they are conflicting. Like, I know that there's a conflicting program going on in Edo State right now, so some of them couldn't attend. And then just to say, when we are doing some of these webinars, we want to have a sign language interpreter, to interpret, or closed captioning, so that persons with hearing impairments can follow. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anguli. I don't know if anyone else has any question. Please kindly raise your hand. Yes, we've spent more of our time. Sorry about that. So I don't know, is there any question, or would that be all? Okay, I think Uju Peace is raising her hand. Please, you have the floor. Kindly unmute. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
we can.
Yeah, I can see someone's hand raised. Please kindly unmute and go ahead with your question. We are running behind time. All right. So since we don't have any more questions, so just to wrap up the webinar, I want to say thank you to all our panelists, all our speakers, for those wonderful and thoughtful responses, and then to participants for your engaging questions and contributions. So just to conclude, let me briefly highlight some takeaways, some key takeaways from today's section, just a bit of it. So yes, so we know the first one I have here is that women with disabilities, they face compounded vulnerabilities due to intersecting forms of discrimination. And then we know that Nigeria has progressive legal frameworks, but significant implementation gaps still remains, which we all need to fill. And then also, my third point here is that, okay, yeah, practical survival. Okay, since we didn't have the last speaker, of course she would have shed more light on survivor-centered responses, which are essential to meaningful change, but unfortunately, she's not here. And then finally, collective action and coordinated advocacy are needed beyond this webinar, and then they're also needed beyond these 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And we must also remember that the fight against gender-based violence is not confined to these 16 days. It is a continuous commitment, and we must all carry that forward. So now I would be inviting Dr. Repito, who is an associate professor at the University of Bradford, to deliver the closing remarks and wrap up our section. Dr. Repito, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jumoke. This has been a really, really insightful conversation around the global 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to our fantastic speakers discuss the intersections between gender-based violence, disability, and women's rights. These conversations are very important, and it is important to also have our participants here engaging with the process, and also the Committee on Women, International Law and Development contributing to conversations. We'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Ben Okoro and Dr. Anwuli Ofuani Sokolo, for your insightful remarks, your insightful presentation, and also just to highlighting the key issues and perceptions around gender-based violence, and just bringing practical perspectives to this conversation for our attention. We'd like to thank the moderator, Jumoke Odedeji. We'd like to also thank the host and chairperson of the International Law Association Nigeria Committee on Women, International Law and Development. I would also like to thank our participants. We thank you for being here with us over the past 1 hour plus. If you are interested in joining the committee, please reach out to Jumoke or Adenike, and we will let you know what you need to do. Thank you all for being part of this conversation, and we look forward to inviting you to even more enlightening conversations and discussions which will raise awareness around these issues. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jumoke.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Repiton, for those inspiring closing words. On behalf of the International Law Association Nigeria Committee on Women, International Law and Development, and Gender Inclusive Climate Change Governance Initiative, I want to express our deepest gratitude to our chairperson, that's Dr. Pedi Obani, our distinguished speakers, Dr. Obioa Ben Okoro, and Dr. Anwuli Ufuani Sokolo, and then in absentia, Miss Oluwaseun Osowobi. Then also to our secretary, Miss Adenike Akode, and then Dr. Irepiton, and then also to our participants for your time, engagement, and commitment. Yes, there's a recording of the webinar. Hopefully that would be shared with all registered participants via email for everyone that registered. So, and then we encourage you to continue the vital conversations in your communities. It should not just end here. And then let us all live here with commitment to raise awareness, amplify voices, and driving meaningful change for women with disabilities in Nigeria. Together, we can build a society where every woman lives free from violence and enjoys full human rights. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.